The last thing I want to do with the perfect competition model is extend it to talk about international trade, okay? And what we're going to do here is show how using a different version of the kind of analysis we've done so far can tell you about, where the price arrives at when two countries begin trading. And we'll also show how trade increases the total welfare of two different countries. But we'll also discuss a little bit about how it increases total welfare, which is the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus, but it doesn't make everyone better off. It only makes everyone better off if there's sort of a policy to help out the losers with some of the earnings of the winners. So let's see what I'm talking about here. So suppose we've got two different countries, home and away. And they're trading in some kind of international, they're each producing some kind of good. Could be something like corn or something that is traded on international markets. This is the global market. So we have three, instead of just two, we're now going to have three. But each one, none of these are going to be exactly like we did before. We're not going to have like the firm analysis and the market level analysis. Instead, we have two different markets, the home market and the away market. And then we have a third market, the global market, which is kind of a clearinghouse for the two. Okay, it links the two together. So each of these is going to be home to a supply and demand diagram. And like so. And so let's assume that the two countries are reasonably similar, have a reasonably similar size. So they have similar demand. Okay. But they have very different supply. Okay. Supply in home is very constrained. Okay. So this is the supply of the good, and home in away is very plentiful. All right. Actually, let's draw it a little different. That's a little too extreme. There's the supply for these guys, and here's the supply for these guys. Okay? All right, so what happens if there's no international trade? Well, in each of these markets, supply and demand equilibrates, and we have this price and this level of quantity. And in away, because supply is more plentiful, they have lower prices, even though they have the same demand, and they eat, they have more of the stuff to eat. Okay? All right, and then we can also do their consumer surplus is this area up here, and the producer surplus is this area here, which I'll shade in a little differently. And in away, there's a much larger consumer surplus, and also there's this similarly sized producer surplus. Okay? Now what happens if they trade, and how do we figure that? Well, if they trade, we can see that these guys have a very high price for this good compared to these guys down here. So if they trade, we would expect the away market to want to sell to the home market, okay? Because it can get a higher price, and people in the home market would want to buy at the lower price available in the away market. So how do we find the price? Well, what we have to do is we have to construct a diagram with the excess supply and demand that each one has over their domestic thing. So what we do is we take the price for the home market and we carry it all the way over to this global markets guy here. And we know that below this price, demand exceeds supply, okay? We can see that here, all right? If the price was to fall below here, domestic supply is smaller than domestic demand. And if we get down to here, there's really no domestic supply left at all. Like, they can't supply anything to meet at those prices. So what we're going to do is we're just going to try and eyeball for me the distance between these two and draw a diagram here of basically the excess demand, which is, I'm trying to draw the gap between this demand and this supply at every price, okay? So then it kind of straightens off like this. So this is the demand from the home market, okay, in excess of what they can supply themselves, okay? Because notice, if the price was down here, they would demand this little bit of extra, which I've tried to say is here. On the supply side, let's draw these guys, and we'll say, like, if the price is above this level, then the firms would want to supply more than the home market would desire to eat, basically, okay? And again, we're going to draw for each price the difference between the supply curve and the demand curve in this away market. And it looks like it gets to about, I'm just trying to eyeball it, probably around here. And it's more like a straight line compared to the other one. So this is the supply from the away market, okay? And where these two cross is where the excess demand from the home market matches the excess supply from the away market, okay? And we can take this price back to both markets. And we're going to get a new global price with trade, okay? So what happens at this new global price? Well, demand goes to here, okay? And so the quantity consumed rises to QH2, and the price falls to this new international price. On the away market, the quantity supplied goes up to QA2, and the price rises to P star. Okay? So we have here the quantity demand is QH2, and this market, just as by coincidence, cannot supply at that price at all. So this is a market that is entirely, everything it gets, it imports from abroad. Okay? All right? And everything that this, over here, the excess supply can't be entirely consumed by the domestic market, and the gap between what is demanded by people at home and the amount that is supplied is exported to this country. And if I draw these diagrams correctly, which I guess I did close, the gap between these two should be equal to each other. So the exports should exactly equal the imports at this new price. Okay? And what's interesting is that we can see that this has a large effect on the gains from trade. This has a large effect on the producer surplus and the consumer surplus of these two guys. So I'm erasing the old ones. Come on. Well, we can leave that one there because it'll stay there. So what does the consumer surplus look like now? For this market, remember, it's the area above price and below demand. So it's this large area here. Remember, notice that this is bigger than what they got before. Okay? And on this side over here, the consumer surplus shrinks. Okay? So these consumers, the home consumers, have benefited from access to imports because they're getting lower prices. The away market has been hurt by this international trade. The market hasn't been hurt, but the consumers have, because now they have to pay higher prices and they get a lower consumer surplus. Okay? But let's look at the producer surplus. So now these producers, we go the area under the price and above their supply curve, and they get this larger area here than they got before. So notice that the total welfare is bigger in both of these, okay? Because in particular, we've got this over here, this triangle here, and this triangle here are additional welfare that we weren't previously getting. Previously, that was when there was no trade. That was just absent. So we're getting extra benefits. But there are losers from this, okay? It's easiest to see for the home country, where the domestic production sector has been completely wiped out, okay? There is no more producer surplus because this sector is unable to compete at the international prices, okay? And the presence of the international trade has benefited the away producers because they have a bigger market to sell for. They're more efficient producers, and so they basically make more revenue, and they wipe out the other sector. They steal all its business, and so on. So, sort of the takeaway is that trade means total welfare. This is supposed to be an O. Total welfare is up, but not for everyone, okay? Consumer surplus is up for the home market, but consumer surplus is down for the away market. And producer surplus is down a lot for home, and producer surplus is up for away. And the fact that total welfare is increased by trade tells us that the gain in consumer surplus is more than enough to offset the losses in producer surplus for the home country, and the gain in producer surplus is more than enough to offset the losses in consumer surplus. That means that a government policy that tried to redistribute some of those gains to the losers could potentially make everyone in the society better off. We could have a Pareto improvement. For example, a policy to tax some of the extra revenue that they get from trade and distribute it accordingly to consumers or vice versa. That might work. In principle, that's a political decision, and you can't just assume that it's going to happen. And it can be difficult to implement. And it's also notable that if you're going to start to introduce politics in this, the intensity of the change is felt very differently. So consumers get lower prices, but this is presumably just one good, and so it doesn't affect their life that much. They all enjoy lower prices on lots of stuff. It's like, if this is corn, we get lower prices for food that has corn in it, but we buy tons of stuff with no corn in it, so it doesn't affect our lives that dramatically. However, if you're a producer and you get wiped out by a trade, that's your everything, right? That was the thing you produced. And so the intensity of no longer having that market is felt extremely strongly. And so that can lead to a issue where of sort of asymmetric lobbying. The people who benefit, if they're wide and diffuse, may not mount a very large lobby to sort of argue for policies that benefit them, but the people who are strongly impacted, in this case, like the home country, those producers might launch a all-out campaign to prevent trade from happening because they know that if they have to compete in the open market, they would be wiped out. And vice versa for the away market. You might there find the producers are a strong lobby for trade because they know that they're going to be able to benefit a lot from it, and the consumers can't mount a very effective defense or argument to close the borders because the loss they all feel is even though there's lots of them, for any individual, it's not that significant. And so that's how you can use these models to do free trade, okay? And we can see here that, if we have a demand shock or a supply shock, we can see how it ripples through international markets, okay? So we'll do one more quick diagram, and then that will be it. So suppose we've got, we've got our demand from both markets. We've got the high supply over here. We've got the low supply, the plentiful supply over here. This is the home market, the away market, the global market, and we've got to find we've got to draw our excess demand curve over here. starts at 0, goes to this, and then it's sort of like that. And the excess supply starts over here, goes something like that. And then where they equilibrate in the middle, we get the global prices and global demand. Okay, and this is imports and exports. Oops. Exports are over here. All right. What happens if there's a supply shock? Suppose the away country has like some kind of huge blight that kills most of their corn. Well, in that case, the supply shifts in. Okay. And now this supply curve shifts. If we draw over here, we can see that it sort of looks like this now. So it shifts this way, and that ripples through the economy like so. International prices rise, and look, now these guys are back in business at least a little bit. They're producing a little bit of the domestic supply. So this is domestic supply, and these guys still export a bit, but not as much as they would have in the past. Okay, there you go.